I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Ellen Fantini.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So today, plenty of news. Obviously, last night was the State of the Union, which Ben will cover. I'm going to talk about the debacle in the Oval Office, because we haven't had a chance to cover that yet, with Zelensky getting kicked out of the White House. Ellen is going to talk about how Europe reacted to that and has melted down over Ukraine. And finally, Amber is going to talk about all of Trump's success on the border. So kicking it over straight to Ben.
Thanks, Will. And yeah, last night's joint session to Congress, I believe, was historic in terms of its length. I believe it was the longest such address. But beyond that, I also think historic, or at least unprecedented, in the acrimony that we saw from the Democrat side, the lack of even respect for the other side, which Donald Trump himself, of course, he kind of pulled the veil off that elephant in the room, and he said, basically he could cure cancer, could solve the world's problems, and the Democrats still wouldn't clap for him. It was a remarkable display from the very entry of Donald Trump into the room, that one side was cheering and celebrating, and the other side not only wouldn't show respect for him, wouldn't show respect for the office, the institutions that they claim to care about, et cetera. And so I think there are kind of two storylines that emerge from last night. One is this victory lap, and also the president illustrating, here are all the problems that we were left with, and here's the way that in the first 40 plus days, the administration has enacted and pursued more vigorously than perhaps any president before an agenda of rebirth, rejuvenation that will lead to a brighter future for America, a new golden age. And then on the other hand, the fact that Democrats couldn't bear to stand, to clap, to recognize almost any of it, with the exception of potentially a forever war in Ukraine, where Donald Trump referred to Elizabeth Warren as Pocahontas, and she clapped for 5 more years of U.S. support without conditions for Ukraine and beyond. She was the only Democrat really to take things in stride, but what she was clapping for was something that appears totally out of step with where the country is. So to me, one takeaway is that last night illustrated that Republicans are the common sense party and the Democrats are an insane party. That was what the president was essentially laying out on immigration, on energy, on crime and rule of law, on wokeness and all of its subcomponents, whether DEI or radical gender ideology, in ticking off all the asinine U.S. aid programs that the president has tried to curtail. And then also in celebrating the American people who have triumphed over or held up those who've been victimized by Democrat policies. Of course, the Democrats cannot abide standing up for those people. There was a great list that someone tweeted out, things Democrat lawmakers couldn't stand up to honor: a tax cut, border being closed, foster children finding hope and success, children murdered by illegal immigrants, police officers dying in the line of duty, steel workers, farmers, we should add, a child with brain cancer becoming an honorary Secret Service member, a teen getting into West Point, advancing military and defense structure, capture of a terrorist who murdered 13 Americans, efforts to bring peace between Ukraine and Russia, bring an American hostage home from Russia, and of course the Comparatore family and Corey Comparatore victims at the Butler rally last year. So all of those things Democrats couldn't bear to stand for. And my takeaway was sort of, this is a joyless party, a smug, a condescending party, also a rudderless party. I mean, all they seem to have essentially is a resistance, which is really non-existent outside of the federal courts at this point. And also, they looked like a party that had zero interest in winning the midterms, in recognizing, at least optically, that the American people rejected their agenda and that they need to move, quote unquote, to the middle and return to some semblance of normalcy and more of a Bill Clinton type Democrat Party. That seems totally anathema to them. Maybe it's because for fundraising purposes for those midterm elections, they need the zealous partisans on their side, and this is going to bring out the dollars from donors. But if you look at what the polling was, the instant polling right after that address, according to a CBS News poll at least, 76% of those who watched approved, 23% disapproved. That's a pretty stunning rebuke to the Democrats' response to it. So I put it out to the group, whatever you make about the substance of Trump's speech, the style and the humor associated with it, and also the Democrats' response, kind of what we're to make of all of it.
Yeah, I thought the speech was very good. I was shocked by the Democrats' behavior. I mean, there's two big obvious problems. I mean, first you had Al Green act like a complete lunatic at the beginning, which I think that the Democratic leadership was hoping to avoid something like that. Like, I mean, he picked a fight over something trivial, like Trump claiming I have a mandate. Well, he obviously does. He not only won the Electoral College, he won the popular vote. He has a mandate by any definition of the word mandate. And then the signs, like holding up those stupid signs. Guys, have you not seen any memes where if you're holding up a sign, people will Photoshop in whatever they want to say? So, and whatever they think would be funny if you came out of your mouth. So don't hold up. Politicians should stop holding up signs. That's sort of like something we've learned 5 years ago. And yet the Democrats couldn't think of any better way. And then, gosh, there was this incredibly stupid picture where you have Max Frost and a few other Democrat representatives, like Jasmine Crockett, like they all, like 6 or 7 of them looking into a selfie camera, looking unbelievably serious, like mean mugging for the camera. And the only analogy I could think of was Arrested Development. And it's like when the Magicians Guild they all got together looking serious and held up a sign saying, "We demand to be taken seriously." I think that actually might be the new motto of the Democrat Party. That might be better than whatever else they've got going on.
Yeah, I think the Dem on Dem infighting over this is going to be pretty interesting because you had Hakeem Jeffries and Nancy Pelosi saying that they wanted to avoid exactly what happened, which was the perception that the Democrats were behaving childishly, that they were giving too much attention to the things that Trump was saying. And Nancy Pelosi even gave an interview the day before, or perhaps it was the morning of this address, indicating that she actually regretted the moment where she ripped up Trump's speech at the State of the Union because the attention ended up being on her disrespect, her ripping up the speech, than on what was actually said in the address. And obviously, a lot of Democrats did not get that memo. And perhaps it suggests that Democratic leadership is losing control of their party to an extent. But I expect more sniping from people both in the Democratic strategist and consultant group, as well as among the top levels of Democratic leadership, against the people who had those signs, particularly Rashida Tlaib, who had like this empty whiteboard where she was writing down messages throughout the address as if she were giving the rebuttal in real time. And I was surprised, in addition to how effective the speech was in laying out everything that Trump has accomplished in this short time period, it also was incredibly moving. So they were able to combine two important things, one of which is listing off accomplishments, providing empirical evidence for the fact that Trump has been effective, and then tugging at people's heartstrings, which is something that conservatives have not been really great at historically, in terms of storytelling. It's kind of a meme that prior to really 2014 or 15, Republicans were always talking about tax cuts in terms of GDP and sort of pie in the sky economic ideals, as opposed to how things actually impact everyday Americans. And I was watching this with my husband last night, and we found ourselves tearing up multiple times throughout some of the guest introductions, specifically when Lincoln Riley's mom and sister were called out when he signed that executive order for Jocelyn Nungaray, and her mom was there with tears in her eyes. And then, of course, the 13-year-old who got the honorary Secret Service membership amidst battling brain cancer. I mean, really incredible, moving moments. And I think that only makes the Democrats' behavior more stark in contrast to what Trump was doing, because they couldn't even bring themselves to show the willingness to honor these individuals who have been going through incredibly difficult personal situations and feel that they have been appropriately honored and respected by the current president. So I think this was an absolute disaster for the Democrats by all accounts, and overall a really effective speech by Trump. I mean, it is also pretty ahistorical for a State of the Union address. Obviously, this is not officially a State of the Union because that's not what you do the first year in office, the first couple of months in office. It's just the joint address to Congress, but it basically was a State of the Union because Trump had gotten so much done. So it was fundamentally different than other speeches we typically hear shortly after inauguration, which is addressing what has been done in the past 4 years and what the president, the executive, intends to do to fix those problems. Well, Trump's already tackled a lot of them. So I thought it was a really great move to have him go out there. There wasn't much notice involved. He just kind of let us know the day before, went out and listed off everything he's done so far. And as my husband said, I actually appreciated that speech for the fact that I forgot Trump had done all of that in this 1 month period, and it was a nice refresher.
Yeah, I think it was also a refresher for, let's say, the lukewarm Trump voter, the people who said, okay, I'll give him a shot. They really got to see what they voted for. So the Trump enthusiasts, of course, were vindicated by not only what he said, but what he said he did and what he did do. But I think also for the lukewarm Trump voter, when they compare themselves to probably their former party, they have to be glad for how they voted.
All right. With that, I guess it's on over to me for the Oval Office Zelensky debacle. So last week, Vladimir Zelensky decided to come to the White House to sign a minerals deal with the United States that would have, been profitable for the United States in terms of developing what rare earth minerals existed in the Ukraine. And then sort of provide a basis on which to start negotiating with Putin. And I mean, this is a very sensible deal from both the Ukrainian and American perspective. From the Ukrainian perspective, it's a soft security guarantee in the sense that the presence of American civilians on Ukrainian soil provides a tripwire, so a reason for Putin not to want to invade because he would risk killing American civilians and bringing America into the war. For America, it obviously makes sense because we might actually recoup some of the hundreds of billions of dollars we spent on the defense of Ukraine. And it gives us some negotiating leverage. President Trump made clear he wanted to negotiate a peace here, but he wants some negotiating leverage so that Putin knows that, one, that we actually have meaningful investment in Ukraine, and two, that in the event that this continues, there won't be any further incursions. So it all made a lot of sense. And so, but Zelensky's had a couple of opportunities to sign this. He had an opportunity with Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, in Kiev. I'm not going to say Kyiv anymore. It's Kiev. It's always been Kiev. 3 years ago, it became Kyiv. That was always dumb. It was Kiev from the beginning. Anyway, and then he met with Vance and Rubio in Munich. They wanted him to sign it. He didn't. He also had some disagreements with Rubio, saying one thing in their private meetings, another thing publicly about his willingness to sign. And then he came to the White House, and he had a 45-minute meeting, and was just utterly obnoxious almost the entire time, rolling his eyes, doing any number of things to try and, kind of poke at Trump and Vance, who were generally very gracious. And then in the Q&A period at the end of, a 45-minute news conference where Trump is getting asked questions, Zelensky's getting asked questions, Trump gets asked a question about diplomacy and why he wasn't super hostile to Vladimir Putin. Trump explained, well, if I'm going to be a neutral broker, I need to be able to talk to Putin. Same thing and then Vance jumped in and also said, we had a president who insulted Putin constantly. It didn't accomplish anything. Maybe we should try being diplomatic. And Zelensky lost it at this point. It's a Q&A session. There's no really need for him to say anything. And he says, JD, what is this diplomacy that you speak of? Not referring to him as the vice president, but referring to him by his first name. And then essentially kicks off an argument first with JD and then with the president when Zelensky tries to say, oh, you have an ocean between you, but soon you won't, that'll only keep you safe for so long, in effect. And Trump rightly called him out and says, well, whoa, you don't get to tell us we're going to be unsafe. You don't get to tell us anything about our problems. Don't lecture us. And the end result of this was he got kicked out of the White House and the minerals deal didn't get signed. Everybody in the world, I mean, it seems like, especially in American media, was blaming Trump and Vance for this, but it's unreasonable. I mean, Zelensky was super disrespectful under the circumstances. We're his patron. He is the beneficiary. He should I think Scott Jennings had the best description of what should happen here. He should have all he had to do was show up, wear a suit, sit down, be quiet, and have lunch and sign the deal. And that would have been fine. And one thing I wrote a pretty lengthy piece on this, was that there seems to be a lack of understanding of just how fraught the relationship is between Ukraine and the American right. And it's specific to a lot of things that have happened in Ukraine vis-a-vis the Democratic Party. Whether it's, Ukrainian officials trying to help Hillary Clinton in 2016, whether it's Ukraine's calls or Zelensky's himself, his phone call with President Trump leading to the faux impeachment, whether it's the fact that the subject of that call, which was the fact that Joe Biden had been doing influence peddling in Ukraine, that he had gotten a Ukrainian official fired, that his crackhead son had been on the board of a Ukrainian oil and gas company for reasons that certainly aren't explained by merit. All this stuff reveals that there should be some understanding that Ukraine kind of needs to show up and be respectful. Oh yeah, and Zelensky campaigning with what's his face with Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania in the run up to the 2024 election. I mean, they lost, their project lost. And yet they're still so disrespectful picking these fights. And I think that Trump and Vance were right to say, you know what, we have broad interests in the stability of Ukraine. We don't want Russia to run all the way to Portugal. But at the same time, we're patronizing you. We've been your patron to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. We expect you to show respect. And it's in our interest as a great power to insist on basic respect from people like this. So I think it was very reasonable. I don't know what you all think, but I suspect you agree with me, but I'll kick it around to the group.
Yeah, I was pretty blown away by the disrespect shown by Zelensky in the Oval Office. As you mentioned, calling the vice president by his first name before making this sassy remark about what kind of diplomacy are you talking about, JD, when Putin doesn't abide by ceasefires? The fact that he didn't wear a suit and was pretty obstinate when he was asked about it. The crossed arms, the defensive posture, the slumping in his chair, rolling his eyes, scoffing at things, and muttering under his breath as the president was talking. This was doomed to fail. I'm dying to know who advised Zelensky that this was the right posture to go into this meeting with. Somebody must have told him that it was a good idea to try to stand up to Trump. But as Trump said in response, you don't have the cards right now, buddy. We're in control. The American people have given you hundreds of billions of dollars. You've expressed no gratitude during this entire meeting. And you are the one who needs us. We don't need you. So for you to come in and start arguing with us about what kind of guarantees you need and trying to negotiate beyond the scope of the agreement that they were there to sign was completely inappropriate. And Trump obviously did the right thing by kicking him out of the Oval Office, out of the White House entirely. They did not go on to their continued negotiations. They did not have lunch like they planned. They gave Zelensky's lunch to the White House staffers, which was a nice little extra touch from Trump. And he showed that he wasn't going to be basically kicked around by this guy who has had every possible advantage from the American people, and as such has expressed no willingness to negotiate peace with Russia. And now you fast forward a few days later, about a week later, and sure enough, he's crawling back to the bargaining table because the U.S. has ended intelligence gathering for Ukraine. They've paused all future aid. And Zelensky realized that he obviously made a huge mistake. And now he's trying to crawl back into Trump's good graces. This is the way a president, a leader, a commander-in-chief should act. If people are relying on the charity of the United States and are not grateful for it, and aren't willing to abide by the US's goals for a foreign conflict or foreign policy in general, then they need to be reminded of exactly who is in charge.
I was going to echo and add a little bit to what Amber just said. The pep talking before the meeting must have just been out of control, not only just on the US side with everybody saying, okay, Trump's going to do this and you should do this and, stand up and, be your own man. I'm sure on the European side, they were all saying exactly the same thing. And then, of course, I'll talk about this in a little bit, planning their response depending on what Trump did or what Zelensky did. But this kind of pumping him up and puffing him up ahead of time was really bad advice.
So as others have counseled, everyone should actually watch or read the full transcript of what transpired during that press conference, because of course the blow up at the end is what everyone focused on, but there was a massive lead up to that. And To Ellen's point, the puffing up of Zelensky and sort of to the extent it was resistance voices whispering in his ear, and there's obviously been allegations of Susan Rice and Chris Murphy and a whole slew of other Democrats who coached him essentially. And there's also reportage that it was Zelensky's choice to even have this sort of gaggle in the first place. Maybe been some further reporting on that, but I heard that at least initially, which is interesting in and of itself. Um, he was basically making maximalist demands. He was challenging the Trump administration's interpretation of history. He was essentially saying the mineral deal is not nearly enough. We need these firm security guarantees, et cetera. And beyond all that, and beyond the ingratitude, of course, he was essentially saying that no deal with Russia will be worth the paper it's printed on with Vladimir Putin there. I mean, he didn't say it exactly that way, but essentially he said Putin's totally unreliable. So if that's your position, you can never make a deal with him. And then what is the end game here of any sort of negotiation? So, and it's also saying essentially that you don't think that the U.S. can ensure that the deal actually holds up. Another attack essentially on the administration. So you put all that together, and I asked the question, and it's sort of rhetorical, but it's also a genuine question. If you wanted to blow up any sort of relationship with this administration, what would you have done differently than what Zelensky did? Again, not a rhetorical question. Beyond that, I think it's worth saying a couple other things. The Europeans who cheerleaded after, these European nations chronically underfund NATO, many of them, and they continue to buy Russian oil, which of course funds Vladimir Putin's war machine. So the hypocrisy is obvious. The US is the singular party that can ensure any kind of durable peace that effectively can ensure that there's sovereignty in Ukraine, security in Ukraine, and not catastrophe. So it was an absurd position that Zelensky took coming into this meeting. Now he seems to be walking it back. He lost the confidence of Lindsey Graham. I think that says it all about what transpired during that meeting. So the question is there a future? The Trump administration continues to extend an open hand, it seems like, to the extent that Zelensky is willing to walk back his remarks. But even in his sort of regretting of what transpired in the statement he put out on X yesterday, still, he didn't say, I made a mistake and I was in the wrong here. There was not a fulsome mea culpa. And I think it just shows you the arrogance and the obstinance of this figure. And he's doing his own country a major injustice by the posture that he's taken. Last point I'll make broadly about these negotiations is, in my view, Donald Trump, the end game here and the long-term view is he wants to take Russia-Ukraine war off the table, and he wants to try to effectuate a reverse Sino-Soviet split. And there's one quote that I think sort of implicitly illustrates this that hasn't gotten a lot of focus. When J.D. Vance gave a long interview with the Wall Street Journal a few weeks back, the focus was on sort of the position, the administration's posture towards Ukraine, and there was a headline reporting indicating like U.S. is willing to engage in military action against Russia, and it totally misread what actually transpired. But here was one thing that J.D. Vance said, quote, "It is ridiculous for the United States to have a posture where we're trying to push Russia into the hands of the Chinese. I think it's ridiculous for the Russians to have a posture where they are fundamentally the junior partner to the Chinese." Trump administration wants to break that because this Chinese, Russian, Iranian axis it poses a major threat to all of our interests around the world. And that is in part what getting to a deal on Russia-Ukraine is about. It's about normalizing relations, if possible, with Russia, and however remote this possibility, splitting Russia from China, bringing it closer to our orbit for the benefit of our national interests.
We can go ahead and move to Ellen for the European response to
great.
what's been going on with the negotiations.
Excellent. Yes, this hypocrisy, the European cheerleading, but meanwhile heating their houses with Russian oil is just a perfect example of let's say the European deep state. So as soon as Zelensky, probably even before he was kicked out of the White House, as soon as there were any sound bites that made it seem like Trump and Vance were being mean to Zelensky, the tweets started. But within hours of the failed meeting, European leaders, Macron, the European Commission President von der Leyen, Poland's Donald Tusk, others, "You're never alone, dear President Zelensky," calling him a hero, calling Russia the aggressor, saying that Trump and Vance were unstatesmanlike. Germany's foreign minister calling Ukraine's fight pivotal to Europe's freedom. Sweden's PM doing the same thing. Of course, any of us looking at these tweets could see that it didn't seem at all spontaneous. In fact, they probably had them sort of pre-prepared. I mean, I don't know if they have like a signal group where they all just send out, okay, here's the tweet, and they all just send it out. Probably they do. But certainly pre-planned alignment there. And of course, these are some of the same countries that worried about Ukraine's massive corruption problems right before they were invaded. So all of a sudden, Ukraine's the problem for Europe. This is what Trump has done, is he's actually said out loud, this is your problem. And so a hastily organized summit in London, Keir Starmer trying to look like the hero of Europe. He escalated that effort. So you had Zelensky, other key leaders there, talking about more aid. Germany's 11 billion, France's 3 billion, trying to put together some peace framework. And then Keir Starmer, who can't even keep his own borders safe, is worrying about Ukraine's borders. He's framing it as a generational crisis, hinting at a, quote, coalition of the willing for future troop on the ground roles. Of course, it's all talk and no action because ordinary Europeans are just not going to do this. So you have these European leaders, but none of them really reflect the actual will of the people. I mean, we've talked about this before. In Germany, the Alternative for Germany, AfD, they came in second recently in federal elections. And of course, they're not going to be part of any government that's formed because there will be a firewall against them. But more than 10 million Germans are certainly voting against more money and certainly no troops on the ground coming from Germany to Ukraine. And then, of course, the photo op. I love this mean mugging. So they're all looking very serious, very serious. We are going to be the ones to save Ukraine. Then you have Giorgia Meloni and Viktor Orban, and their roles are different but similar. So Giorgia Meloni seems to have positioned herself as a bit of a mediator. So she's been pro-Ukraine, lots of photo ops with Zelensky. She's hosted him in Rome. So she can't be seen as a Putin apologist. But she's also engaged with Trump directly. She attended the inauguration. She talks peace with him. So it seems like, she's tried to position herself as a bit of the mediator between the US and Europe and Zelensky. And then, of course, Viktor Orban, Hungary's Viktor Orban, who's taken a peace position from the very beginning. He praised Trump on X, saying, "Strong men make peace, weak men make war." So obviously, Europe's outrage is not going to hold up. Their militaries are completely underpowered. I mean, Germany's got 180,000 troops. France is going to posture, but will never deploy anything. The U.S. has 100,000 of its own troops already in Europe, which is like almost the same as Germany. So although there's a lot of talk about pledging troops, pledging the coalition of the willing, none of that's going to happen. It's certainly true that the question for European governments is the following. Who are these government's going to enlist to fight for Ukraine. So Rod Dreher recently pointed out in a piece that a 2024 Gallup survey found that in the EU overall, 46% of those polled said they would not fight if their own country were invaded. 46% wouldn't fight for their own country. And 50% of Britons said they wouldn't fight. 57% of Germans said they wouldn't. And 78% of Italians would refuse to join combat. And that's in their own country. So I think Zelensky has realized his only hope is to go back hat in hand and say, look, I've got moral support from Europe. How about some financial support from the United States of America? What do you all think? Predictable?
Yeah, I'm not surprised by their conduct. I think, it's remarkable to see these European countries get all huffy and get just like how incredibly indignant. But then, in public, they're super indignant. How dare the Americans do this? In private, they're telling Zelensky he needs to go back and make up with the United States, which is also, once America actually cut off the aid, Zelensky posted almost a full mea culpa on Twitter, or on X rather, to the effect that, something needs to change here, and he's sorry or he regrets what happened in the Oval Office. But it struck me through all this that it feels like our European allies don't really feel like great allies. They feel like allies of the Democrat Party. They seem to want to be overtly publicly hostile to the president of the United States, and they don't acknowledge the fact that what Zelensky did was disrespectful. They play into the broader media narrative that somehow it's Trump and Vance who are at fault for Zelensky showing up to the White House in a tracksuit and acting like a lunatic. And I think if these people are actually our allies and have sufficient respect for us as the patrons and as the people whose security umbrella they live under, I would expect them to be a little more even-handed and a little bit less indignant about how we used our support. So I'm really not impressed by a lot of these European countries, especially the Western European countries and their conduct. This whole kind of rebelling against Trump, it really feels like teenagers rebelling against a disciplining father.
Let's not forget also the ingratitude there as well. We have provided a security umbrella over Europe. Western European nations and others have used that to run a massive welfare state, to have mass migration that undermines their own sovereignty and security. As J.D. Vance laid out, you have these leaders there who are acting in anti-democratic ways, opposing all the values and principles the Western civilization is supposed to be about, and effectively on our dime with our protection. And that's just something that's untenable long term. And I think that's one of the reasons why the administration had Vance give that speech of you're kind of with Western civilization or not. And if you're with Western civilization, that requires certain commitments to it. So, the rupture that has really been caused by the Europeans. And the question to the Europeans broadly is, if the rationale for this war is not only that you believe in the cause of defending Ukraine, but that if Ukraine falls, then there's going to be a Hitlerian march through all of these other European capitals, then why aren't you operating that way? Would you have bought Adolf Hitler's oil to fund his war machine? Would you have chronically underfunded your defense if you thought that that was the potential outcome? So it just seems like it's disingenuous, and the European powers talk very loudly and carry no stick at all. And that's a damaging place to be.
Not to mention the fact that Biden, of course, killed the Keystone XL pipeline almost as soon as he took office, which only further empowered and enriched Russia at a time when he was supposed to be apparently the guy who was tough on Russia. And I thought it was interesting, too, how Germany, in the midst of all of this, had to abandon their clean energy proposals or their green energy proposals because they weren't able to keep up with, Nord Stream pipeline, not Keystone pipeline, but or took sanctions off of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in Russia after he killed the Keystone XL pipeline, just to clarify. But then also you have, again, Germany abandoning their green energy programs because they couldn't actually supply their people. And what did they do when they had to do that? Well, they ran to Russian oil. So There's a complete disconnect, as Ellen said, between the words of the European leaders in regards to the Ukraine-Russia conflict and their actions.
So
Right.
one other note here. Sorry.
Mhm.
It tells us a lot that the European governments are also panicking about USAID funding falling off. They rely on the Americans at the same time, as Will said, that they act smug and virtue signal against the Americans.
So yeah, with that, I'll take over my hosting duties as I had to briefly, relocate, and because there's a tornado warning in my area, so we'll see if I keep it, hopefully it doesn't hit us. But I'll pass it over to Amber to talk about the border.
Yes, absolutely. So JD Vance, the vice president, is making his first trip down to the southern border as vice president this week on Wednesday. And I thought it was worth kind of running through the action that we've seen at the border, because if you obviously rewind to the previous administration, we were told repeatedly that Congress needed to pass legislation, this debacle of a border bill that was anything but related to border security, in order to decrease the number of illegal crossings. Well, Trump has been in office for less than 2 months, and border crossings are now at their lowest level in recorded history because of his various executive actions taken on border security, as well as just the signal that it sent to illegal immigrants that it's not going to be so easy to cross anymore. You probably will get caught. And if you get caught, you will be deported. We're not doing catch and release anymore. You're not going to get a free ticket into the United States where you can basically disappear into the interior and never show up for your court date. You're going to have to go home. And if you try to come back, the consequences are going to be potentially even worse for you. Then, coupled with the mass deportation operation, you have a lot of illegal immigrants choosing to self-deport for fear of being caught up with ICE. And the numbers that have been reported for the first full month of Trump's administration, so from January 20th to February 20th, there were only 200 encounters at the southern border that did not result in apprehensions, and 8,326 apprehensions. And to do a side-by-side comparison, some of the heaviest months during Biden's tenure were 200 to 250,000 apprehensions at the southern border. And of course, this does not include all of the gotaways who might have been able to cross in between stations where, or places where Border Patrol agents were stationed. There have been 20,000 ICE arrests in the first month, and Axios reported that this is the lowest amount of border apprehensions since 2000, which is when Customs and Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection first started actually recording that data. So it doesn't take a massive piece of legislation. It just takes a little bit of political will from the executive. We actually had a reporter at the Daily Caller who embedded last week with the Mexican National Guard, and they walked him through some of the actions that they've taken since the proposed tariffs were set to take place on Mexico, which Trump, of course, delayed after Mexico announced that they were going to deploy 10,000 National Guardsmen and otherwise take actions to try to prevent the flow of fentanyl into the United States. And by all accounts, the Mexican National Guard said that this program seems to be working. One thing I learned that I thought was absolutely amazing in terms of amazingly stupid is that apparently Mexico was not checking vehicles before they crossed into the US side of the border. It was only the US border agents who were responsible for that. Well, now they are checking vehicles, and they've seized massive amounts of fentanyl and other illegal drugs through that process, and also have created a system where the cartel feels less comfortable, of course, even trying to send cars through in the first place, because there's a higher likelihood that there's going to get caught if there's more than just one set of eyes on the vehicle. They've also put National Guardsmen at known places where coyotes gather and prepare people for border crossing. So actually stopping them before they even get onto the US side of the border. Several rather remote rural locations, particularly up in the mountains, where they knew for a long time that the cartels were using these as meetup points and organizing points. But for whatever reason, were not encouraged by the Mexican government to actually go to those places and break them up before they're able to human traffic those people across the U.S. to the U.S. side of the border. So we've seen a massive improvement in just 1 month, even compared to Trump's first term, by the way. The record apprehension number during Trump's first term was in May of 2019. It hit about 100 to 120,000. I can't recall the exact number, still only half of what Biden experienced, but about 100 to 120,000. At that time, he implemented the Remain in Mexico policy, safe third country agreement. He had a similar deal with Mexico to deploy Mexican National Guard to their side of the border. And the numbers came down to about 60 to 70,000, sometimes as low as 50,000. Now we're at less than 9,000. I mean, you can't overstate how much of a massive improvement this is. And this coupled with the deportation operation, again, 20,000 arrests by ICE in just the first month. A long way to go because there's 20 to 30 million illegal aliens in the country. But just a massive amount of progress in a short period of time. And again, is indicative of what you can do if you are a little bit creative, and also if you're willing to actually have a little bit of use of executive authority and political will to accomplish these goals. And being completely uncaring about the media narrative, by the way. There were some claims early on during the deportation operation by the media to claim that it was heartless, that people were going to hate deportations once they actually saw what was happening. And I think not only was the Trump administration really smart to focus on messaging on the most violent criminals who were being deported or who were being put in prison, thanks to the mass deportation operation, but also because things were so bad under Biden, I think they correctly predicted that the American people are actually okay with everybody going back.
So I guess today there's a House committee meeting with 4 mayors of these sanctuary cities, Boston, Chicago, Denver, New York. And I'm not sure if it's still going on, and I haven't really seen anything about the testimony, but in reading about how these mayors were preparing for the testimony, I thought it was kind of hilarious that they're being prepared so that they're not embarrassed like some of the college and university presidents were embarrassed when they were confronted with their anti-Semitism. So the fact that these mayors have to do damage control to try to justify their sanctuary city policies, which are obviously contravene federal law and are obviously the opposite of what the voters want. I think it's pretty funny that they're preparing not to be embarrassed.
Just briefly, because I don't have much to add on the substance here. I think that Amber is right to point out that at the end of the day, this all comes down to will. It was never a matter of capability to close borders and have sovereignty, and certainly now to effectuate a deportation effort requires political will and skill there as well. But there was a line last night that Trump set forth that I think really captured it perfectly. And he was basically saying the Democrats kept saying we need new legislation, new legislation. Turns out all we really needed was a new president. And particularly on the issue of immigration, of course, where presidents have wide latitude and substantial authority to control immigration. This is true, but it also goes for many other issues as well, singularly in the form of an executive who has a vision and is willing to use every lever of power to achieve it in areas of foreign policy and defense, and certainly when it comes to securing our territorial integrity. The president can achieve it, and he just needs an executive branch to actually faithfully execute the tasks that he delegates to it. And that is obviously the major fight, which the courts are obviously engaged in right now, about the executive's ability to exert his control and reassert his control over the executive branch. And I think we can see victories in areas far beyond immigration to the extent the executive is able to reassert his control over that branch, and the administrative state is not an unelected and unaccountable fourth branch of government that we never voted for and that defines tyranny as the founders understood it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to be a little harsher on the Democrats for it. They insisted you needed legislation to solve this problem. They lied. It was false. They just lied about that. Um, and I saw something in the Democratic response yesterday that I thought was notable. Alyssa Slotkin, the Michigan senator, gave a generally, forgettable address. But one thing she said, which I thought was interesting, was she tried to say, Trump is trying to close down the border, but he's only looking at the symptom of the problem. He's not solving the underlying cause. And it's like, I'm sorry, come again. We just reduced illegal crossings by 95% in a month. Clearly, the actual underlying cause was failure to enforce the border, failure to stop people and deter them effectively from coming over. And she made another claim like, oh, we need to, have a comprehensive immigration reform, which means amnesty, right? Like the Democrat thesis here is you can't solve the border crisis without giving amnesty to illegal immigrants that are here, which is incoherent nonsense. And it's really just a lie. And Slotkin got sort of some praise for like being a moderate or showing reasonableness. Well, I mean, but really what she's demonstrating is that the Democrats have been insane on this issue and continue to be insane on this issue. And really, we need to make this a new default expectation. No, it's on the president with the authorities he has to stop illegal immigration. Trump has proven that it can be done, and every president from now on should be expected to do exactly what Trump is doing to ensure that illegal immigration stops. All right, with that, final thoughts. I'll take the mic on this one at the outset. I think the interesting thing that happened this morning is that there was a temporary restraining order in this USAID case where a district judge in D.C. ordered the disbursement of some $2 billion. The Trump administration did something to appeal it, and so originally I heard this and I thought, oh gosh, we somehow did not prevail. Like there was a 4-person dissent that would have thrown out the TRO. But a legal expert I trust, Bill Shipley, who's a former federal prosecutor for 20 years, he thinks that what's happening here is actually not quite as bad as people are saying. That what's going on is that because the Trump administration didn't directly appeal the temporary restraining order, that there's an issue with regular order, but that it's not clear at all that the money will go out the door, and that there's still a preliminary injunction hearing that should get heard within the week. So I think, I'm eyeing this cautiously because I want to see the Supreme Court step in and put a stop to all this temporary restraining order nonsense. But I'm cautiously optimistic that they will get their act together and that today's ruling is not nearly as bad as people are making it out to be. So we'll see about that.
My final thoughts are on what Ben mentioned in his segment, which was the fact that the Trump administration was extraditing this individual who was responsible for the planning of the Abbey Gate bombing that killed 13 American service members during the withdrawal of Afghanistan. He's also accused of planning other attacks that led to loss of life in the hundreds. And what I find interesting about this story is that once again, we see something that happens within the first 2 months of Trump's administration. And the Biden administration had 3.5 years to apparently find this guy and failed to do it. All it takes is turning this into a priority, apparently, according to the Trump administration. They made this a priority on day one, and they said through increased interagency coordination and intelligence sharing with regional partners, Pakistani officials were able to find them. Why was it not a priority for the Biden administration in the 3.5 years since the Afghanistan withdrawal in the summer of 2021 to find the person who was responsible for this attack and bring him to justice and provide some sense of closure for the victims' families and the numerous individuals who were injured by this bombing attack? It just continues to boggle the mind, the incompetence combined with the malice, frankly, because you have to have some malice to think that finding this person who planned this attack on American service members should not have been at the top of your list on the national security part of your administration.
So I'll go back to Will's parting shot on this Supreme Court decision to vacate essentially an application here from the Trump administration. So this case concerns this $2 billion in USAID money that a Biden-appointed justice, one of his last justices, by a 50-49 vote, imposed, where not only did he say that the Trump administration could not freeze the $2 billion in contracts to be paid out, but they had to pay them out, and they had to do so very quickly, an impracticality, essentially, from the Trump administration's perspective. So the Supreme Court, to Will's point, didn't rule on essentially the temporary restraining order that was imposed itself, didn't rule on the underlying merits of the case, but they did sort of speak by not speaking. The Supreme Court essentially said, to a layman anyway, we're not prepared yet to go into any of those sorts of deeper issues. We want the trial court to clarify its order on the $2 billion. And the exact language is clarify what obligations the government must fulfill to ensure compliance with a temporary restraining order with due regard for the feasibility of any compliance timelines. And so the expectation is that then after this TRO goes away or there's a preliminary injunction that turns the TRO into what it really is already, something almost beyond an injunction, because it's not just freezing the government's freeze or unfreezing the government's freeze, but it's saying you must pay immediately. Then you're going to have the Trump administration challenge it. It'll go to appeals court, then it'll go to the Supreme Court, and maybe it'll prevail. Maybe the Trump administration will prevail at the Supreme Court. But the fact that there were 4 Supreme Court justices who dissented and who wanted to get to the merits of this thing, I do think is telling, and it shows you just how brazen the trial court was here, and Judge Ali was a single federal court judge, as we've talked about before, imposing effectively a nationwide injunction and going even further than that here, in particular because usually, and Will, as a lawyer, can correct me here if I'm wrong, but when you're dealing with the challenge of a claim, essentially, regarding a government contract, there's a federal claims court for that. It's not even in Judge Ali's jurisdiction. So my argument would be, or I think the question that the Supreme Court has to answer is, in allowing regular order to take place here and essentially the case to ripen, does that outweigh that sort of institutional precautionary measure, the slowness? Does protecting the institution outweigh the damage that's being done to the Constitution in real time when you have this judge way out over his skis here? And Justice Alito, in his dissent, which was joined by Thomas, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh, said this: does a single district court judge who likely lacks jurisdiction have the unchecked power to compel the government of the United States to pay out and probably lose forever $2 billion taxpayer dollars? The answer to that question should be an emphatic no, but a majority of this court apparently thinks otherwise. I am stunned. And again, I think that the response from Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett would be, well, we need to let this thing play out, essentially, and there to be regular order. But there's going to become a time where the hesitancy of the Supreme Court to step in, I think, is going to cause effectively a constitutional crisis, a crisis that's being caused by radical judges and the radical plaintiffs who forum shop these cases to these lower court judges in the first place. I think we're in for a reckoning with respect to nationwide injunctions. And Alito himself also says that there has to be another reckoning between, and this is in a footnote in his dissent, their clarification of the standards for distinguishing between a temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction is a matter that deserves this court's attention at the present time. And that's because there have been these temporary restraining orders imposed on the Trump administration, halting basic policies like being able to remove subordinate officers in the executive branch. And the courts have stepped in and issued these TROs, which are generally unappealable. Can that happen? Can you maintain, essentially, our constitutional order when one federal judge can block and micromanage an administration across the country in these universal injunctions, and there's no ability to appeal for 2 weeks or however long the TRO persists? So nationwide injunctions broadly, and then TROs in particular, the Supreme Court has to grapple with these issues. And the question is, are they going to get there quickly, or is there going to be a lot of damage done in the interim to the judiciary and to our constitutional order itself while the Supreme Court defends its institution within the judiciary?
My final thought is that the Democrats didn't just disgrace themselves last night, but they disgraced themselves yesterday by blocking the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act, which sought to keep girls and women to ban transgender athletes from girls and women's sports at federally funded schools by defining sex as it should be biologically. So not a single Democrat voted for the bill. It's a complete disgrace. They obviously hate Trump more than they care about girls and women. They care more about trans and the activists of the transgender ideology than they do about their own daughters. So the Democrats disgraced themselves yesterday, not only last night, but when they voted against this obviously reasonable bill.
All right. With that, thanks everybody for tuning in. On behalf of Ellen, Ben, Amber, and myself, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next NatCon Squad.